Good morning, everyone. I'm Ksenia. I'm from Nesta, and I'm delighted this morning to be speaking to Dr. Pragya Agarwal about her book, Sway, The Science of Unconscious Bias, that launched a few weeks ago. We will spend a few minutes asking Dr. Pragya questions, and then I'll open up to the audience as well and read out questions that can be answered to you. Good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. Yes, thanks for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
Have you done most of these book events online, or did you manage?
Absolutely, all of them. Yeah, I mean, my book launched on the 2nd of April, and I had a long list of events and festivals. And so lockdown started just before then, just right before then. So I have to improvise. Yeah, so all the events have been online and virtual.
Well, congratulations on the book. Congratulations on managing it in this strange circumstance. The book is just fascinating. It has so much information, insight, and evidence. It's clear that you've really thought about it and gathered all these different types of insight in writing this book. So I'm curious to kick off with asking what inspired you to put it all in one package and describe it in this way. What motivated you to put it in a book like that?
Thank you so much for your lovely words about it. Yeah, I had hoped that it would be a comprehensive account of our biases, but I wanted to look at it in a very non-judgmental way. We've been talking about unconscious biases for the last couple of years at least. There's been a lot of talk about it and organizations talking more about inclusivity. But the book is inspired a lot by my own personal experiences as I've brought in and at times in the book, but also my research, my academic research was a lot about how technology has biases built in them and how it's not a very objective view of the world as we often consider it to be. So kind of all brought together. And I'd been working with small organizations as a consultant, working on their biases, working on their diversity agenda. And I realized that people were talking about unconscious bias in a way that there's a real danger that it could become like a buzzword and it would lose its meaning. And so I really wanted to bring all the research, science into it to back it up with evidence rather than people just dismiss it as something that is kind of a trendy word.
Yeah, I can understand that. And what I was thinking when reading this book is what a time to launch it, because we are in the midst of this pandemic where everything is testing our ability to confront our biases, partially because there is not enough evidence about the virus that we know about, but also because there is so much misinformation. And I wondered if from your reading and from all this evidence, there are particular biases that we should be conscious of when we are trying to understand and make sense of what's happening in the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough time, and there are obviously, because as we are all working from home, we have less exposure to diverse views and diverse people as well, because we are more likely to be in our echo chambers and filter bubbles where we only hear back what we think and believe in. And our social media algorithms, which we are relying so much on for information at the moment, actually perpetuate these kind of echo chambers where we only like people who have the same views as us. We only agree with those, and the algorithm only shows those kind of things. So that can get really reinforced around this time where we are working virtually, we're working remotely, we're relying so much on our social media for information. And there's also this kind of negativity bias where we are more likely to believe in negative information than positive information. And it's been shown it's a cognitive bias. So we are more likely when we get any information. So we've heard how WhatsApp groups are perpetuating these kind of negative bias, information and myths that are going around and fake news. And so we are more likely to believe those kind of negative bits of information than any positive information that comes out. We also heard how certain people of Chinese origin were being discriminated and prejudiced against because of the way the virus originated and because the president of the United States called it a Chinese virus very explicitly, which means that due to the Horn effect, a negative attribute is kind of then spread, and they more negative attributes are assigned to them. So that way, prejudice and stigma is kind of reinforced as well against certain kinds of people. So and also we're seeing gender bias as well at the moment, because as people are working from home, I've written about it on Forbes and Grazia, and people are talking about how less women are publishing at the moment, and there are less papers being submitted from women academics as well. So women are carrying more of the emotional load, mental labor, physical labor at home, in families as well, due to childcare and juggling. So those are some of the biases that can actually, I think, getting reinforced during this time, and we have to be wary and conscious of them.
You correctly point out that all of this is happening online. So all of this mediated by technology, which in itself carries its own biases. And in your book, you have a whole chapter talking about that. So what are the main implications and the main things that we should be aware of there?
Yes, so as in my book, I talk about how technology actually reinforces some of the societal biases, but it also creates new biases as well. But at the moment, specifically, I think there's a lot of socioeconomic inequalities are being heightened. So because we're relying so much on technology, who has access to technology, who has access to bandwidth, who has access to fast Wi-Fi, who has access to all these things, is becoming really, who has access to a private quiet room amongst family to do all these virtual meetings. So these kind of inequalities are really being highlighted and showcased, and actually people, so in some ways I think it's taken us for this to happen, but I think in some ways I hope that it can be a positive thing, that people are becoming aware of it. But also through technology, I think neurodiversity, we've been talking about how atypical people are find it difficult to read facial cues when we are communicating through technology in Zoom meetings. So they rely so much on face-to-face interactions to read body and facial cues, and that can be a disadvantage to people who find that difficult. And although we think that we are only meeting virtually, I think we've seen enough research that Zoom can actually be very intensive, cognitive intensive for some people as well. So I think introverts, people who are not as extrovert, might find it difficult to voice their opinions, even more difficult to voice their opinions in the Zoom meeting, perhaps because they feel like they have to interrupt somebody and the way that the communication works. So people have to adapt to this different kinds of communication, and it can really disadvantage some people more than others.
For sure. And well, I'm sure we all experience this by trying to navigate the working from home. And I guess there is so much pieces of evidence and so many facets, if you like, of the bias, of the unconscious bias that you're talking about. And it made me wonder. Well, I think that in reading the book, I almost felt doomed that we can't really do anything about it. And for one, it seems very difficult to hold in one's mind all these different types of biases to be aware of at the one time, even if you wanted to tackle them. But also the meat of this argument is to what extent we can actually control it, and to what extent this is nature or nurture, if you like. So are we born in this way, or are we learning this from our environment? Do we have any hope from your perspective to be less biased?
Yeah, I think reading it all in one place can feel like we are doomed, as you say. It can evoke a feeling of despair. And I talked about it. I was talking to somebody else on Cosmic Shambles the other day, Robinins, and he was saying the same thing about how it can evoke a feeling of this despondency. And I said, yes, while I was writing the book, at times I felt quite sad and disappointed, and whether there's any hope. But I always try to keep this. I hope that the book would try and keep the same message alive, that we have to make hope possible, and I think rather than despair convincing, which is a quote by Raymond Maxwell. And I feel like by doing that, by acknowledging, by understanding the biases, by understanding the science behind it, we can reflect more on our own biases, and that way we take individual responsibility and collective responsibility for the biases that exist in the society. So it's not just individual biases, it's systemic and structural biases that affect decisions and interactions and actions. And I hope that when we have information, we can actually act upon it. And that's what the book is trying to do, to give the information so that people make these decisions in a more informed way. And Yeah, I think the question of nature versus nurture is quite interesting, and it's an age-old question. And I think I try to address in the book, because the first chapter, a couple of chapters, is all about evolutionary biases, and how biases are rooted in our evolutionary past. And in the past, or as our ancestors, we we were designed to be cautious against threat and fear. And that's where a lot of the biases come from, that we react to fear, we react to threat, and we form these kind of in-group, out-group mentality because we are designed to survive. And so human beings were, so it's the survival instinct that Darwin talked about. And so they reacted against people. They had to really quickly identify who doesn't belong to their tribe or who doesn't belong to their group, and that's a threat to their survival. Yes, some of these biases are rooted with it, and we've seen the neuroimaging section as well, neuroscience, that our amygdala reacts to threat and fear, and it gets fired really quickly, and it has to process this information really, really fast because there's so much information coming in. We cannot process all the information on a rational level. But what happens is that now we are not in the same situation, and that's what we have to understand. Our world doesn't work in the same way. We have sometimes more time to understand these biases or these reactions that we have, and we have more time. We can take more time to make these decisions because it's not often a matter of life and death that when we make these decisions, but we still fall back on our instincts. And when we fall back on our instincts and we make these really hasty, spontaneous, kind of quick decisions, then we are more likely to fall back on these templates that we have in our brains, and the templates that define stereotypes, the stereotypes that lead to bias and prejudice and discrimination and stigma. So we have more time and knowledge and consideration. We can give it more consideration now. So I think, yes, some of the biases can be rooted in our wired inside us in a way, but I don't believe that. I believe that we all have the capacity to actually step back and make rational choices and rational decisions and educate ourselves so that we can actually change these templates that are inside us, that might be a result of our upbringing, that might be a result of the way that we have learned these biases. And if the biases are learned, then they can be unlearned as well.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I wonder, I was reflecting on your point in the book about how the world has changed, and perhaps we're not in these situations anymore where we need to survive, if you like, and make and use those shortcuts. But then we are talking about this situation of a pandemic, and not all of us are in a situation of life and death. But ultimately, I guess the idea of the concept of a rational choice is complicated by the fact that we don't always have all the facts and all the evidence. Yeah. So I'm curious how your and mine desire to tackle some of these biases and to confront them works with this idea of intuition or gut feeling, where we're invited sometimes as leaders to make decisions based on our sixth sense, and there is sometimes a positive and optimistic color to following your intuition or following your senses, if you like. So what's the relationship between that notion and the idea of rationality?
Yeah, I mean, as I talk about in the book as well, about the whole notion of gut instinct. Yes, we should follow on our gut instincts and intuition at times, because sometimes we don't even realize what kind of instincts we have and what kind of decisions we might make on those bases. And yes, leaders are advised that. I personally don't think that when we are making important decisions as leaders, we should follow our gut instinct and our sixth sense and our intuition, because a lot of them means that we are taking very quick, fast decisions. A lot of them mean that we might fall back on these templates or these shortcuts, as you say, in our brains, in our decisions. And I think some things like that sometimes lead to for example, just as an example, it might lead to things like hiring for fit, for instance, because we have an instinct about a person. We think this person's going to fit really well into our group or a company or an organization. And this kind of idea is perpetuated, that if we have the really strong feeling about a person, then that person is right for a company. But that means that we might be falling back on our instincts about our beliefs, our false beliefs about certain things, like maybe that we believe that extroverts are more dynamic or are more worthy as leaders. Or we might believe that certain people who are taller or looking a certain way or dressed a certain way might be better fit into our organization. We might feel that a person who went to a certain university, had a certain kind of education, might be a better fit. So then we are not judging the facts on as they are, and we are not assessing people against each other, but we are making very individual decisions for each person. So that's just an example of when our instincts and intuition can fail us. And I think we all rely on that. I know that sometimes when I'm looking at a number of CVs and there is a really quick, we just have to make very quick decisions. We are not judging all of them against kind of a specific set of indicators, but we weigh each person against each other, which can actually mean that we make these decisions or we rely on our sixth sense or our instincts. So I personally don't feel like some of the business decisions and some of the important decisions should be based on our instinct and our sixth sense.
Thank you. There's a good question in the Q&A, wondering whether trying to address this at an individual level is quite difficult, and whether it is possible to design group processes instead that address these biases. What's your take on that?
And that's an interesting question. Yes, I feel personally that we have to take individual responsibility to a certain extent, because a lot of these group or systemic or structural biases are also a result of our individual biases as well, because they get reinforced in kind of a wave, and they get spread and propagated like that. And we are the ones who are responsible for our decisions to a certain extent. And so it's our responsibility, moral, ethical, to educate ourselves, to be very aware of our biases. But saying that, in certain context, for instance, in an organization, there would be decisions that are based in a group. And then I think the collective responsibility becomes really important as well, because it's not enough to just act alone. It's ultimately the group has to make a decision, or the company has to have this kind of ethos, and everybody has to be in the same page, so to speak. And so I think individual responsibility is very, very important. And it's the only way we can actually feel accountable for some of the decisions and actions that we take. And we have to hold this accountability. But ultimately, this is the collective responsibility is the one that's going to make a real difference to some of the systemic and structural biases that are so deeply rooted and deeply ingrained in our society, in our workplaces, in our organizations, in our culture. So I think it's both things. But saying that we cannot individually make a difference is, I think, not enough now.
Building on this and to another question that was just popped up in Q&A, what have you seen working in terms of developing this individual accountability and developing individual awareness of biases, as well as perhaps the group process design? So the question specifically in the Q&A talks about unconscious bias training and what you think of that. But perhaps there are some other techniques and methods that you have looked at evidence for.
Yeah, so in terms of unconscious bias training, I think from the organizations that I've worked with and the research that I've done, a lot of the training is based around the IAT, which is the implicit association test, which was developed in Harvard. And that's kind of considered the ultimate kind of test of your biases. And I critique that in the book, and I discuss that in the book, because I think we don't often understand what the test does. It's actually just showing you the associations you make between different words at one certain instance. And so we might say, I might think that apples are always red rather than green, or more likely to be red than green. And so that's an association I make between red and apple. And those are the kind of things that it tests. So it can show you the templates that you hold in your brain, but it's not a training. It's only giving you a snapshot. It's only giving an indication of the kind of these links we form between different concepts. And that can show maybe the racial biases we have, or the gender biases. We might think men are better leaders than women, or we might think that Black men are more threatening. So those kind of biases emerge. But that is just one step. That is just step one of doing this kind of training. And often a lot of organizations stop at that. And they think you've got your score. So if your score is not very high enough, you're not very unconsciously biased. Or if your score is high, then maybe you need to take further training or tests or read a report. But that doesn't really build the bias training into the ethos of an organization. Unconscious bias training has to be a regular, consistent process. We cannot fully erase our biases in half an hour or half a day or one day, you know. And moreover, I think a lot of the people are very scared, defensive when we start talking about biases and prejudices, because we all like to believe we are very fair-minded and we are very egalitarian. We don't hold any biases. We are educated. How can we? We have many friends of color, or we have appointed many women in our organizations. How can we have these biases? So people get defensive. So I think it's really important to give a kind of non-judgmental platform to people in an organization to be able to voice these biases as well, to talk about the microaggressions they might have faced, the things they might have found difficult, the things that stop the organizations from being inclusive, the obstructions that they face, it's the feeling of belonging in a workplace. That has to be really understood. And what biases, unconscious biases do, or the lack of inclusivity does in an organization, is stop or hamper this feeling of belonging in an organization. And so I think it has to be inbuilt into an organization's policy. It has to be something that everybody at different level agree with and talk about in an open, transparent, non-judgmental way. And so the IAT test or taking these online tests can only be the one step in this whole process, I think.
I think this has opened up to a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm just going to pick on a couple of other follow-up ones. Someone is asking whether, so I work for a company that creates training in virtual reality to reduce unconscious bias through embodiment and the use of a mirror. What do you think of the involvement of VR for this kind of training?
Yeah, I've talked about that in the book, and I think it's a really useful way. I think it's a useful mechanism to do that, because research has shown that when we step into somebody else's feet or shoes, for instance, we are more likely to understand how they feel. So this kind of, and there's been some research done where for example, to address medical and healthcare biases, nurses have been given these kind of situations and scenarios where they've been asked to consider how the patient might have felt in certain things. And when we create this empathy, when we create this kind of compassionate response to something, when we ask people to see the situation from somebody else's perspective, then it can really help people understand how these biases might have worked or impacted other people. So I think, yes, VR is one way. It's a mechanism to understand, and embodiment really works in some situations. But again, I think it has to work in conjunction with group discussions, and it has to be an ongoing process. Just doing a few sessions of VR training or embodiment session training cannot be enough, but it is a useful mechanism, certainly.
There is something in what you've said that connects to another question and one observation I made also about the book. I think I've mentioned to you when we first met to talk about the event, and you talked particularly about this idea of vividness. And I think the actual quote from the book is that much of our implicit biases arise because of our tendency to notice something vivid. And really stood out for me because in my own research about empathy, vividness is associated with a way to create greater emotional self-awareness and emotional awareness of the feelings of other people. And so I think that's what you were talking about when you were describing the potential effects of VRs. And there is another question whether understanding one's emotional reaction to a situation can help us. How can we make a decision and become more aware of these biases?
I think that's, as you say, that's, yeah, very, very good point. It's that emotional awareness is really important, that empathy is really important, and those two link to each other, absolutely. And when I talk about vividness, it's also what I'm also trying to say is that we notice things that stand out. So when we meet somebody, we will notice their gender, we will notice their skin color, we will notice their accent, and certain biases emerge from these kind of vivid demarcators of people and situations and context as well. So I think that's a separate point. But yes, emotional awareness and empathy can be a really big way into understanding how people are feeling. And often we don't do that. Often we keep emotion out of business, or we try and tell people that you don't have to react in an emotional way. Or if we say that this is how I felt, we are not able to articulate that sometimes. So yes, I think it's really important to be able to talk about when some A happened, B happened, this is how I felt. And how do we bring that into the organization? How do we give people a way into talking about these emotions is very important, I think.
Thank you. A couple of other questions on technology. I'm definitely moved into the Q&A section now, but there are some really good questions. So you mentioned that technology is mirroring and in some instances exacerbating the biases we have, both in the workplace and the wider societal biases. What, if any, opportunities do you think we have to reset post-COVID?
Yeah, I think, again, as I have a whole section in the book about this, and I talk about a number of technologies, and then talk about voice assistants. I talk about even simple things like passport photo booths in supermarkets, how that have biases, the cameras. Our facial recognition system is hugely biased because it's all built in the data that's captured from the real world, or any data set, any data that these machine learning algorithms are trained on are collected by certain people. They made these choices, decisions. They're based on past histories. And it's only a snapshot of the world. And this snapshot is usually based on the norms about what is the norm. And anything that's away from the norm is considered an anomaly. And the technology doesn't tackle very well. I think COVID, that's a very, very good question. I think, as I said, we're using technology more and more, and we've just suddenly realized how vulnerable our technology can be as well. We've been so reliant on these kind of communication systems, and so about how these cameras capture different skin color, how they capture different accents. So, for instance, it's a very simple example. When I try to do a captioning on a video, it was finding it really difficult because of the accent. And so how do you make sure that we are able to do that easily? How do we make sure that the person doesn't struggle with the technology because they don't fit particularly in the template that the technology was designed on? And that kind of, when it creates a cognitive load, any kind of technology, it becomes very difficult to use. It creates a feeling of frustration. It creates a feeling of despair amongst people. And that makes them feel othered because they know that they're not the social norms. So that's why the technology isn't able to deal with them. And so I think some of these ways of communication, the way of facial recognition, videos, all these technologies will have to consider how they're dealing with different skin color, different accents. I think that's going to become more important than ever to look at that.
Yeah, do you think we can overcome that? So is there enough of a traction that we can create with those who create the systems like AI to help mitigate the risks as well as reap the benefits of those? Is there anyone who's doing it well?
So a lot of work is being done in research labs, and MIT has been doing a lot of work in this. And they've got these labs that are looking at some of these facial biases, recognition biases especially. I know that Google, after the UN report came out about the voice assistants and the gender bias that's built into these voice assistants, and how it reinforces the view of women as being subversive, and the kind of responses that they were given, which can lead to kind of perpetuating sexual harassment against women. They have looked at some of these technologies, and I have an update in the book about how they're dealing or tackling with some of these. So yes, pressure from some of these action groups is coming in. People are talking more about digital and internet safety and how feminist the technology is or not. And so there is pressure, but ultimately it becomes a kind of a cycle where there's not that much traction because of the funding, about investment, about who's actually making these decisions, who's sitting at the top levels, who's sitting in some of these investment meetings. And so it becomes I think it is a difficult question to talk about whether there is enough traction at the moment or not. There we are seeing some differences. We are seeing some positive moves. We are seeing how people are developing new technology from the ground about which can tackle these things. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And as we are seeing during this time, some of the organizations are cutting off their diversity budgets as well. And we've been seeing more talk about that, because we don't have enough budget. We had in an economic downturn, then the diversity budget is going to be cut. And that is something that is hugely concerning at the moment for me.
This resonates with some of the other questions about the workplace. I'll turn my questions towards the workplace again. One of them is whether you think multicultural teams are better suited to tackle these biases.
Yes, absolutely. I think when we bring diverse voices in, then we can make more diverse decisions. And I think some of the times we see example of that. We see evidence of that. Certain decisions come out, certain things are put on the social media, certain decisions that organizations make. And you think, was there any person of color in your team who could have stopped you from putting that out in the world? How did you make that decision? And so I think people who've had a different worldview on the same situation can be very helpful, because then we are not just all falling back on our confirmation bias. We are not just doing what we think is right, what everybody agrees on. We have some dissonance. A certain amount of dissonance can actually make a difference. Certain different kinds of voices which can say, no, actually, if you look at it from this perspective, this might not be a very good thing to do. So I think, yes, but then how do we manage these multicultural teams is very important. And also, it cannot just be a box ticking exercise. It cannot be just that we are appointing different people of different heritage, different cultures, but do they all have a voice? Are they all involved in the decision making, policy making? How much voice do they have? I think that those things become really important.
I think that's right. And it's not just making it a tokenistic kind of block in the system that is there for compliance reasons, but rather for real benefits to organizations. Is there a way to understand what sort of a kind of, has anyone done some sort of cost benefit analysis to interventions that help tackle those biases? So if we were able to show that we are moving away from relying on these templates, and there is a positive result from it, how much we measure what sort of advantage that created for an organization? Or is it for you not a cost benefit analysis question, but more of a values-based question?
That's an interesting one. And I think, yes, organizations have to do a cost benefit analysis. And I see a lot of talk about it's really good for business. I kind of shy away from that, because for me, yes, it's a values-based thing, because an organization has to reflect the society. And if our society is multicultural, multi-heritage, then it has to reflect that. It's not just about whether it's good for business or not. It is ultimately, of course it is good for business, because we bring diverse views in. We are actually looking at the world from different perspectives. And that can only be good when we widen our horizons and we actually consider, as I said, what from different perspectives. But it is ultimately, yes, it's a value system based thing, because any organization has to be inclusive. It has to give an equal opportunities to everybody, no matter what their caste, class, skin color, gender. And I think that is a question that every organization has to consider. Why are they going to focus on diversity and inclusivity? Why do they want to do that? And that's really the first question I always ask when I work with organizations, because what is your goal? What do you want to achieve? Because if you want to measure it, there are very few measurable indicators for this, because it has to be a long-term thing. You cannot measure any change in 1 week, 1 month, even a year. It's very difficult to measure any really tangible change. But if you really think that this has to be built into the values of an organization, that's a very different thing. It has to be done over a long period of time.
Yeah, for sure. And as some of the questions point out as well, there are, there will be negative effects created by these decisions too. So there are probably trade-offs in terms of speed, how quickly decisions are made, and that's something that organizations probably would also take into account, but not necessarily will always be able to put value on in terms of monetary value. Back to the technology and the questions of social media. How can great understanding of unconscious biases be used to counter the heightened effect of social media, and particularly the effects that you were talking about at the beginning of the conversation around how we perceive information, having to deal with it online in this way? These platforms accentuate our inclinations and monetize our attention. Under lockdown conditions, these inclinations are magnified. How can this be countered, and which actor is best placed to take such action?
Yeah, how do we counter this? At the moment, as I said, we're relying so much on social media and we get so much information from social media. I think let's stop and take a step back before we react. Our instinct is to react so quickly, like something, dislike something, block somebody, mute somebody. We all do that. We all just want to retreat into these zones of comfort that we have. And we don't want to face any uncomfortable kind of truths sometimes as well. So I think using social media not as a way to get information is probably sometimes a really good way to go. Yes, it gives you immediate news, it gives you immediate information, but it also amplifies a lot of chatter and negativity around some of the information as well. So maybe use evidence, maybe use other reliable media to check on any information when we get it. I think that's really important. Again, it's also always a matter of taking a step back, not just immediately reacting to something, not just being very quick in our decisions or judgments of something. And that takes time. And I know that it takes a lot of effort, sometimes cognitive effort, and we can't do that with every bit of information that's coming in. But we can try if it's an important bit of information. At the moment, we're seeing so much information around COVID and coronavirus. I think it's important that we keep our zones of these kind of channels open. So yes, we all follow and like the same kind of people all the time. Perhaps step out of that as well sometimes. And maybe try and see different perspectives as well. And the social media algorithms work in a way that we cannot sometimes do that, because it only shows us what we want to see and what we believe in and what we hear. And that's why sometimes the dissenting views can come as a shock, because we think, if I believe like this, if everybody around me believes like that, which is confirmation bias, because we surround ourselves with people who look like us, things like us, act like us, talk like us. So I think sometimes acknowledging that we have confirmation bias, and we can actually try and step out of it and think of the other views as well. And there was an interesting experiment that was done about two people who took over each other's social media accounts once from very opposite polarized political positions. And then they found out just completely, it was really an eye-opening for them, because they hadn't even seen this worldview before, and they haven't even realized how many people feel like this. And so I think it can be really useful for us, not because we want to be swayed by that, but because it will help us make better decisions, understanding that there are other people who feel differently as well, and why do they feel like that, and what can we do to mitigate that if their worldview is not the view that is ethical or moral.
Seems like patience and challenging one's own assumptions is our virtues. Very hard ones in lockdown, I have to say. So we talked a lot about the individual responsibility and the steps that people as individuals can take to challenge their own biases and to become aware of where they are taking these types of shortcuts. There is a challenge here in the Q&A. Someone saying, I disagree with the focus on individual responsibility. We're not taking seriously enough the way we have evolved to operate in groups and the many subconscious embodied collective levels of functioning. The individual choice is part of it, but it's being overemphasized. The view is very atomistic. So I know in response you talked about both the individual and kind of the group processes, but I wonder if you can talk about the latter a bit more to say what is your view on the types of processes and the types of challenges we can create at that group level?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question. Let me see if I can I personally don't think that, I'm trying to read that question and try and take it on board. I personally don't think it's a very atomistic view. I don't think it's being overemphasized. I actually don't see an emphasis on individual responsibility. Actually, we always talk about collective responsibility in an organization. We always talk about the organizational policies. We always talk about what's an organization doing, but we don't talk about individual responsibility. And I don't think it's overemphasized in any way whatsoever. Yes, it cannot be the ultimate goal. It cannot be the solution to everything. But how can we change things if we don't take individual responsibility? That's what I personally feel. How can we shirk this accountability and responsibility? Yes, we are not going to be able to make wider social structural changes, but everything starts from a person and it has a cascade effect. So I don't personally think that it's being overemphasized. I think in fact, the contrary, it's underemphasized. I think individual responsibility is not given as much importance as it ought to be. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
I wonder if one way to look at it is in organizations, some individuals also act as system architects, if you like. So as well as being responsible for their own biases and for their own shortcuts that they take and needing to become aware of, they're also design the very systems that produce some of these shortcuts. And maybe that's where the individual and the collective meet. So, if you imagine someone is leading a people team, for example, or a whole organizational leader, so their decisions and their biases may not just impact the people who they interact with directly, but also the effect of their decisions will be then impacting on all the other stakeholders who are interacting with the system too. And so that's...
Yeah, I think it's a cascade effect, isn't it? It's ultimately, it's not just about taking individual responsibility alone and just acting on it, but it's also influencing other people in a way that you then share that individual responsibility out. So I feel like it kind of spreads out when we all start taking individual responsibility. It amplifies it, magnifies it. And as you say, some people have more power in a way, or some influence in a way. And I think when they start from an individual responsibility, then that collective responsibility is easier to happen sometimes.
Mm. And there is also the element, which is also another question, of where you have just group confirmation. So if you're part of a group that is not challenging a norm, then even as an individual, you have that strong value. You may not feel empowered enough to do so. Again, any tips from you of how to stay true to one's own moral compass and not be swayed by what the environment or the group around you are doing?
Yeah, that's really, it's a very difficult thing, and I don't have any easy answers for it. Obviously, I think, yes, it can be really hard to challenge. It can be really hard to be the one who stands out. And I think we all want to conform. We all want to be accepted. We all want to fit in. We all don't want to create a stir. We're kind of designed to not create a fuss and to be challenging to other people, or to cause discomfort to other people. And I think that's what our natural instinct is. That's what our natural fallback situation is. In some way, I think it's about changing culture. And in some ways, it's about starting early, I think, as well. So I don't know what the solution, I don't have any, as I said, big solutions right now. I think it's about starting early with children. It's about education. It's about giving people a strong moral compass from a young age. It's about what parents and educators can do from a young age within their own context. It's about making little changes every day. And it's about ourselves questioning our confirmation bias all the time. And I think once we strongly start feeling that this really matters, then we might be able to hold on to our moral compass more strongly, I think. So as I said, I don't have any big solutions or answers to this yet.
I think you're right. It's a very difficult question, but I guess what it made me think of is what types of systems might we want to interact with to try and tackle this problem. So education, as you mentioned, is one of them, but you probably can think of others. I wonder if the health system will become a bit more aware of the inherent biases, given the what we've learned about the effects of coronavirus and how it unevenly impacts different groups of people. Actually, I remember from the book, the example you give on the IIT specifically is about nurses and how they treat patients coming from different backgrounds, isn't it?
I have a big discussion in the book about healthcare bias and medical bias. And I wrote an article in the Independent actually on the 29th of March when we're just starting to talk about coronavirus in the UK and the lockdown and COVID. And that point, I think there was a person, a Black woman who died. And in response to that, I wrote about how healthcare bias might become a really big thing in the next coming few weeks. And now we're seeing more of a conversation around that, around not just how it affects different people because of their biology or the genetic makeup or anything like that, but because of the systemic biases that exist where people are treated differently by doctors and nurses as well. But also the doctors and nurses, we're seeing so many in the NHS who have actually succumbed to the virus, have been people of color, have been people from these minority ethnic communities. So we are seeing the people on the front line who are actually being put out, or who are actually people from these communities. So it's really raising a lot of questions about who takes the burden of our society. Who are the people who are not considered ill when they are supposed to be? And so all these things are really coming to the forefront. So that article in the Independent might be worth reading because that covers a lot from the book as well. But yes, it's highlighting so much about gender and race, and our, as I said at the start of the talk, about our socioeconomic inequalities, and definitely our biases in terms of how we deal with people, how we make judgments about people, especially the medical biases. There's a lot of discussion that's going on about how women react differently to certain tools and diagnostic tools, and also certain vaccines, and how they react differently to different viruses. I have a slight kind of cautionary note in that, in these discussions, because I feel like some of the discussions are focused so much on the difference between men and women, or the sex differences or the racial differences, that it can lead to essentialism, about gender essentialism and biological essentialism, that we've been trying to get away from for so long. So rather than focusing on these kind of essentialistic nature of these differences that we have, if we focus more on the systemic and structural discriminatory things that are in place in our society, which lead to these differences, the way that people are perceived differently, or the people who are reacting to these things differently, or the people are treated differently, then I think it's a more fruitful conversation. And I think that's really what this discussion should be all about how our society is different. And in the start of the whole discussion around COVID, I was really concerned because everybody was talking about, all the celebrities were putting out these videos of nobody is different, the virus is going to treat everybody differently, but the virus doesn't discriminate, but it's actually how people are impacted is different based on our position in the society. And I think that's what it's really showcasing us. And I think that's what we need to really focus on. Only then we can start making any positive changes.
So your point is that we should combine our understanding of biases with what we know about the inequalities in the society.
Absolutely.
And then understand how our biases exacerbate some of those structural inequalities. Yeah, I can see where you're going with that. I guess the other thing, the other kind of area or arena I was thinking about is naturally media, and we've obviously talked about the social media as well, but also thinking about how media used, in political debates. And one good question here is around the individuals and groups who use the unconscious biases against us to manipulate effectively people in certain decisions, and we've seen that in many of the campaigns. What sort of point of entry do we have into that system? Is it again leaders? Is it individuals who run this, or are there any other type of measures we can take to safeguard against this?
Yeah, I think I make this point in the book, and I discuss a lot about partisan politics and about how our biases are used against us, and how and these are manipulated to create these kind of divides. And we're seeing a rise of partisan politics, not just in the UK, but around the world as well. We're seeing how the feeling of fear and threat is used, because when we are fearful, we are threatened. We are given this view that you should be fearful of certain communities or certain kinds of people, that your status quo is being threatened, your position in the society is going to be threatened by certain people or by certain groups of people. Then we are more likely to fall back on our biases. And that's an age-old thing, that it's kind of a divide and rule thing, that people are, that's what politicians use, that's what media uses as well. This notion of fear, they're coming to take your jobs, or they're coming to get you, or they're going to create more violence, or more violence is on the rise because of certain communities. Or so this kind of partisan politics is a way of manipulation of information and manipulation of our biases, and it in turn reinforces and perpetuates it. It creates more discrimination, it creates more divides, it creates a stronger feeling of in-group and out-group mentality. And once we are rooted in it, it's very difficult to step out of it. And I think that's what's happening around the world, and I'm seeing more and more of that. People are scared of losing what they have. People are scared of losing their status quo. So that's what happens in all kinds of, any kind of change you want to make. That's the whole fear that all the prejudice is rooted in, really, in the end. Yeah, I think, so I've kind of lost the thread of that point that I was trying to make. But yes, the whole discussion around partisan politics that I have in the book, it has numerous examples of how biases are used against us, but what we can do to actually mitigate that. And again, it comes down to recognizing that this is happening. Again, it comes down to how do we tackle this feeling of fear and threat or attack on our status quo? It's about recognizing our privileges as well, in a way. And when I say the word privilege, some people get very defensive about it because they think we don't have any privilege. But I think we all carry a privilege, and we need to understand our intersectional nature of privileges that we all carry. Privileges is something that makes things a bit easier for me, or for anybody who, for any or either of us. Without these privileges, there might have been more obstructions in our path, even more obstructions in our path. So being yeah, so we need to actually, I think once we start acknowledging these privileges, we are more likely to be able to understand that we don't have to feel fearful of other people who are likely to change the privileges that we've held in the society.
Yeah, that's a I'm just amazed how much sort of the themes that kind of coming through from our conversations are the same. This patience and taking stock, being humble almost in the face of all these potential biases that are impacting us. So we only have a few minutes left, so I want to focus the last few questions on again, what can we do about it? Because I think that's what everyone's now asking. What can we do? So one question is a very good one, and it is about who gets to participate and therefore carry the burden, the emotional burden of trying to tackle some of these biases in organizations. And probably quite typically there is a group of people, and there may be kind of sometimes they're called DNI network groups, who are leading this effort for the organization, but then end up carrying the emotional burden of listening to the experiences of people in organizations who are impacted by the biases, and then probably feeling that they have some accountability for sorting it out on behalf of the organization. What have you seen in terms of the organizations helping these groups and teams to deal with the issues you're talking about effectively, but also helping them with the emotional burden too?
Yeah, it's a really, really pertinent question, and a tricky one, because often it's like, if you're talking about racial biases, often it's the people of color or the minority ethnic members of the community who will take this burden, who's considered to take, who's actually expected to take this burden of educating others, to talk about diversity. And it can be exhausting to carry this emotional burden of having to educate others and having to say, this is how it affects us, and so everybody needs to consider that. Again, we come to the position of privilege. People who are who don't feel these discriminations as acutely, who don't feel these biases as acutely, are in a privileged position, and they don't feel they need to talk about it. They don't feel like they need to educate themselves. They don't feel like they need to carry this emotional burden sometimes in organizations. And that can be really exhausting. And I think that's when I talk to managers, I talk to leaders, I talk to organizations, I really look at how their organization is structured and who is carrying this emotional and mental burden of doing the hard work, who's expected to give their time, who's expected to take, because they are expected to give their time. And I work in academia. Yes, people from minority ethnic communities are expected to give their time to sit on these committees, to chair these committees, to talk, have these meetings, to set these agendas. And yes, that can feel like we are giving you the position of power, we are giving you the opportunity to do that and to make these changes. But that's also an emotional, mental burden and to give this extra time and energy to it. So yes, I feel like when I talk to organizations and when I work with them, I really look at why this diverse, again, it comes back to this point of why is this D&I agenda really important for them? Why are they doing this? What is this committee doing? Is it really inbuilt into your policy structure? Is it really inbuilt into the kind of organizational ethos or not? Because if that is the case, then it shouldn't be really this separate arm that it's doing its own work on its own and trying to make a change. It should be really inbuilt into how the company is structured. How are you supporting women? How are you supporting people in coming up? Are you promoting them actively? Are you asking them to apply for jobs, for promotion actively? Are you supporting them? Are you amplifying their voices? And those kind of things have to be done on a kind of a policy level, on an organizational level. It cannot just be solely left to a small D&I committee made of 3 or 4 people to carry this burden on their own. So I think that is a really organizational level question that has to be addressed at that level rather than, I completely agree with the emotional burden that has to be carried by some of these groups of people.
Mm-hmm. So to finish off, what should each of us do? So we have 135 people, plus you and me, on this call, and we will be thinking about how can we learn from this book in many ways. So I'm thinking immediately, how can I be more aware of my biases in my interpersonal relationships? How can I think about in terms of my organization? And some people might be thinking, what can I do to see policy change in terms of the impacts that we have on inequality? What are your takeaways from this amazing body of knowledge that you have gathered? What are the things that we should all do later today to start on this journey?
Read the book. No, that's besides that, I think when sometimes we talk about biases, as I said, we can back it up with evidence, we can back it up with research. And I think that's what I was trying to do with the book, to give a lot of research and lot of evidence, lots of case studies to say, I'm not the only one who thinks like that or feels like that. This is what's actually a broader issue. This is what research has shown. So even if today you write a letter to your manager or an email saying, this is how I think we should approach things, or this is how I felt, or this is what's happened, there is a whole body of research to back it up. And I think sometimes people take on board things which are backed with research and evidence rather than on a kind of a personal level, which is not ideal, but that's how we work in organizations. We should all make sure that we educate ourselves. We should make sure we expose ourselves to diverse views. We should make sure that we are consciously, actively being an ally to other people as well. So if acknowledging our privileges and being an ally to other people is very important. That comes down from individual to collective responsibility, I think, as well. And if you see that somebody who's being discriminated against, prejudiced against, biased against, not given an adequate opportunity to speak up, stand up for them. Lots of people these days on panels, I think I appreciate those men who say, I see this panel made only of men. I am not going to be talking on this panel. Can you find a woman of color? Can you find different people to actually be on this panel? Some people actually actively put out this mission statement saying, I will never speak on a panel that's made solely of white women or made solely of white men. So this is being a true ally. And I think this comes away from being an individual accountability to spreading and being a cascade of responsibility. And this is how we can make positive action, positive difference. And I think even if one person starts doing this in an organization, I think I can vouch that it will make a real big difference in the organization. So
I'm sure we all feel inspired by that, and more to learn from the book that you've written. Thank you so much for your time today and for the responses and for writing the book. I hope everyone's enjoyed this conversation, and we will be posting, I think, the link to the video so people can refer back to it later. But for now, thank you again, Dr. Pragya, for your time, and have a good rest of the week.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for listening. Bye.